Hey y'all, this is Ethan Sawyer, aka College Essay Guy, letting his Southern Roots show once again. My goal is to bring more ease, joy, and purpose into the college application process. Welcome to the CEG podcast. CEG stands for College Essay Guy, by the way, where it's my job to interview some of the most brilliant minds in the college admissions world, analyze their genius, and break it down for y'all into practical, actionable steps you can take, whether you're applying to college or helping somebody else apply. This is the first of two episodes on homeschooling and self-directed learning, something that, for me, as a father of a 4-year-old, I'm way into right now. My guest on this episode is Becca Orlowski. She's a teacher and consultant with more than 2 decades of experience in the independent homeschooling world. On this episode, we talk about what are some common homeschooling myths. Is it true, for example, that homeschooling is just way too much work for any parent in their right minds? Are colleges biased towards homeschoolers? Are they biased against homeschoolers? Neither or both? What kinds of folks choose to homeschool? And can parents homeschool and work at the same time? We'll even get into some of the nitty-gritty of the different homeschooling styles, how academics differ from public schools, and practical tips like what is the difference when you're trying to apply to college? And for example, how much detail do you need in your transcript as a homeschooler? And then, of course, lots of resources and recommendations. Thanks for stopping by. Hi, friends. My guest today is Rebecca Stewart Orlowski, also known as Becca. Becca has a BA in communicative disorders with 2 specialized teaching credentials and taught in deaf and special ed classrooms for 5 years. She's been independently homeschooling in California for 21 years and has been an independent educational consultant for 8. For many years, Rebecca has served as the California Homeschool Network contact for gifted homeschoolers, and she specializes in guiding gifted and twice exceptional homeschoolers. Rebecca, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Ethan. I'm excited to be here.
Who calls you Rebecca and who calls you Becca? I'm curious.
That's a great question. Most people call me Becca just because that's my nickname, but I have friends who are very close who just like the name Rebecca, and it sticks. Just don't call me Becky, and we'll be good.
I'll try not to. Great. I might switch off back and forth. So I want to just be really upfront with our listeners, because you and I have already talked about this, about my bias or my my engagement in this topic, because as my daughter is, 4 going on 5, and we're getting ready to think about how we're going to school her, and looking at public and private, just on the horizon has suddenly come homeschooling. And as we were prepping a little for this podcast and, over email, I was like, this kind of sounds cool. So I've got my college essay guy hat on, and I've definitely got my dad hat on, listening for, is this potentially the future for my daughter and our family? So you know that already coming in, but I wanted to say that for folks.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's a perfect time to figure it out. It's a great age to really think ahead.
Tell me a little bit about how you got into the whole homeschooling thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, my eldest son was your daughter's age when I jumped into homeschooling. In my case, it was sort of a twofold thing. My eldest son was extremely active, wiggly, could not sit still, and he was also very academically advanced in math in particular. So I tell the story of when he would swing on the swing set out in the backyard saying, "Mommy, give me a math problem." And by age 4, but by age 4, he was doing multiplication, division, squares, and square roots. Wow. Being an ex-special ed teacher, I thought, what school is going to know what to do with a kid like that? And so I went to a one-day homeschooling conference and found out that in California, you can homeschool pretty much any way you want, and I was off and running.
Wow. Well, what folks don't know is that there's one of those conferences coming up in 2 days, and Becca's speaking at it, and I'm considering going. So
yeah, it'd be fun.
Yeah. And just in general, for folks who end up homeschooling, why do families end up doing it?
Yeah, that's, there are a lot of reasons. I think, particularly maybe here, across the country, actually, I interact with, homeschoolers all over, and it can be anywhere from, like in our situation, having like really academically advanced kids, and the local schools aren't meeting their needs. I've had people come to homeschooling through, illness, and, missing a lot of school. Families with kids who have learning disabilities find homeschooling to be a lot better for their kids. And of course, there's, the ones we hear about, like athletes and performing artists whose schedule just doesn't allow traditional schooling. Even military families, certainly difficult, bad local schools. And then just, people who just feel like I want to be in charge of my, my children's education. I think I can do a better job than the local school can.
For you, I'm curious, what would you say were some of I'm big on core values. What were some of the core values that you found were really important to you as you went through the process, even as you got like a few years in? Like, what did you value most?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, again, and this is actually something I talk to families who are either considering homeschooling or who have been homeschooling, but then are struggling to kind of fit back in the box as they consider, as they move toward college applications or whatever. So early on, I kind of discovered something called unschooling or self-directed learning. There was a great book, unfortunately, that's out of print, but it was by an author named Lisa Rivero, and it focused on self-directed learning. So really that was the core value for our family, was just, what do you love to learn? And let's find a way for you to learn that. So with my older two children in particular, I have three sons that I've homeschooled all the way through. I have a 14-year-old at home that I'm still homeschooling. Just really, what do you want to learn? So for my eldest, that was, math and physics and literature. And for my middle son, it was, art and writing and just listening to books on tape for, just hours and hours and being outside. So that was my philosophy, and every homeschooler, I really encourage them to think about their own personal philosophy because it's really family dependent, really unique.
Right. I want to get into some of the myths because there are a lot of myths about homeschooling, and I'm interested in potentially debunking some of them. But one of the ones that I just want to kind of tee off with, one of the ones that's in my head, is that I imagine when I hear you say that you homeschooled three sons, that to me just seems like a full-time job, like a full-time, like three full-time jobs. Is that what you found?
Well, yeah. And I mean, it will kind of segue into the myth. One of the myths of homeschooling is, this old picture of, mom sitting at the dining table, and teaching the kids, or they all have desks or something like that. And so it's almost a misnomer to say homeschooling. In fact, a lot of homeschoolers, we kind of joke is that we're not home enough, a lot of times. So at a certain age, I transitioned from teaching, when they're young, to being a facilitator of their education. For my eldest son, it happened really early on because he was so advanced in, STEM in particular. So, so it was more about managing schedules, finding resources, and rather than, I'm sitting down and teaching all my kids at once.
Right. So what are some other myths about homeschooling?
Right. I think the big one that, people talk about is, what about socialization? So many of us heard that question early on. And actually, I think it's kind of a valid question only in that, homeschoolers some homeschoolers need to be more intentional about making sure that their, kids are around other kids, but by and large, it happens naturally. And I would actually come back and say, in some ways, homeschoolers are more at an advantage because they're with kids of all ages. They're with adults of all ages because they're out in the community. They're at their co-ops. They're volunteering, in different places. So they're not just in one classroom with the same age kids. So, so I don't I suppose there are little tiny pockets, but I suppose that there are pockets of, difficult social situations at school too.
Well, the image I imagine is like the homeschooler is the student who has spent all of their time, like almost like the movie Room. If you ever saw that movie where it's like just the mother and the child like in a room, and that kid hasn't had any interaction. And what I'm hearing is like that's just not true. Like there are actually tons of opportunities. In fact, I think your son had some pretty cool opportunities to socialize. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And my eldest is an interesting story because in some ways there are homeschool communities, but he was not really a part of a homeschool community per se because of his eclectic interests, but he built community around each interest. So he was a competitive chess player. So he had chess friends. He was a mathlete, if we don't know the term, basically he did math and physics competitions. So he was a part of a math circle here locally, which, he ended up making a lot of friends there. He was a baseball player, so he was a very good baseball player. So he did the local Little League, and then he went on and played for a high school team for a couple of years. He was a musician. He was a part of a group of, that played a strings, concerts, and he was a part of 2 rock bands, actually. He played violin in a couple of rock bands. And then he was really involved in our church as well. So, so he just had a ton of outlets. And, even my middle son, who's more introverted, he found most of his interactions through our co-op and then later through music, because he's a musician. He'll be going to school, as a music performance major. So, so plenty of, opportunities, but we were intentional. So I would say, intentionality is important. Maybe some of the other myths, homeschoolers can't get into good colleges or they have to transfer, that's obviously not true. If you just do a Google search of homeschooling in college. I mean, my eldest son, again, is just an example. He graduated from MIT and got into a lot of really good schools. My middle son got into University of Pennsylvania, among some other schools. So that's just not true. I think one of the other ones that really is, I think maybe years ago, it may have been the case that colleges were biased against homeschoolers. And there are test optional colleges, which, for homeschoolers are not really test optional because we do need objective, data in order to assess homeschoolers' readiness. But, by and large, every college that I've ever interacted with, they welcome homeschoolers. They just want to see, evidence like every other applicant. So I guess one of the other myths is, only conservative Christians homeschool. And that's definitely not the case. I live in California and we're such a diverse place for homeschool. I mean, what's really cool about the homeschool community in California is that we are so diverse from just very extreme political backgrounds. But when there's an issue that threatens the freedoms that homeschoolers have here, every group, Muslim homeschoolers, Jewish homeschoolers, agnostic, atheist homeschoolers, Christian homeschoolers, we all come together to support and, to protect our freedoms. So it just isn't true that, homeschooling is, there's one particular face of homeschooling. And, and then, probably the last, one of the last myths that we combat, is parents just can't teach their children. Number one, a lot of homeschool parents don't teach their children as they get older. I think, every parent who cares about their kids is pretty good at teaching them, in the early ages. We just, we have the internet now. We have co-ops, there's so much that we can do. We work with each other. But, as I said, I was an elementary school teacher. So I aside from sign language and dance, I don't have the ability to teach high school level courses, but I didn't need to. I outsourced, whether it's through the community college or co-ops or, online classes. I didn't need to teach my kids. So, so I think it's really good to educate people just really what it can look like to, quote, homeschool. That's a great way to educate. As I think you and I talked, we used the word like it's just another alternative for education, really.
Right. One of the things that I'm imagining some folks are listening for is like, can I, on a practical level, can I homeschool my kids and also have a full-time job? Or can I homeschool my kids and also have a part-time job? What is your sense just in terms of the way that parents have been able to make this work?
That's a really great question, and it's not an easy answer. I would say, full-time working parents, it's going to be a lot more difficult, particularly in the younger years. Now, I've always worked very part-time. I was a jazz dancer very part-time for years, and then I built up my business over the past 8 years. And I've worked part-time, and that's worked fine. Particularly my youngest son is older. I think you need to be really creative, really intentional. You need to get help. So it might be, I've known single parents working full time who homeschooled. So, they use a community. So they use the community of homeschoolers. They might barter for babysitting, so that they can work while the child is at home. They might hire somebody to come in for a few hours. They hire tutors. They do classes. So the key, if you're going to work and homeschool, is to really be, and it's funny because it's funny you mentioned that. I just met with a parent of an elementary age child who's working full time, and they're bantering the idea of homeschooling. And so we talked about the fact that, planning really needs to happen ahead of time. Who's going to be responsible for what part of the education. So, homeschooling really is, it can be called community-based education in a lot of ways. And of course, here in California, we have lots of charter schools, and a lot of parents use charter schools that have class days, and, they offer teacher support. And so it's out there. You just need to do a lot of research.
So, Becca, what are some of the different methods, or if you like, the different flavors of homeschooling?
As I mentioned, each family kind of makes the decision on their own what works best for them. It's, based on personal philosophy, also based on the parents' personalities, and of course, number of kids, type of learners of kids. So, obviously I talked about the fact that we kind of glommed onto a self-directed type of education, basically following our kids' leads, filling in quote unquote requirements as needed as we march towards the, senior year and college applications. But that's one way, self-directed. Structured homeschoolers really feel it's important to, lay out lesson plans every day, make sure that their kids are up at a certain time, learning, because this is what they know. This is what they're comfortable with. This is how they feel they get things done. People who love to check boxes really appreciate structured. There are a number of homeschoolers who use classical education, which I won't go into detail. Your listeners can Google that, but it's a very structured type of homeschooling, and it covers a lot of really, in-depth learning. And so, you really have to be structured in that method. Online learning, of course, is huge. Homeschoolers can incorporate that into their own style of homeschooling, but there are just so many online providers for pretty much every subject that you can think of, all the way from elementary up to college level. So definitely, a lot of homeschoolers use online courses. Eclectic is just what it says. It uses a variety of methods, whether it's, online, structured, self-directed, co-op, it's basically using every type of method that seems to work for your family. Unschooling is really basically, child-led learning. So letting the child, dictate what they're going to learn, when they're going to learn, how they're going to learn. It's kind of almost like it's a lifestyle. It's really a family choice, and unschooling definitely can look different in different families. I would say, as I may have mentioned, we kind of started as unschoolers and then kind of moved into self-directed, relaxed homeschoolers. Basically, okay, here are the topics that I think, we should cover, but how we're going to do that might not be structured like other homeschoolers. So, Yeah, so lots of different ways. It's great, to get online and just read and really understand the various ways that people do this type of education.
We're going to get into some resources in a little bit. I'm curious, Becca, if you could share a little bit about some of the ways that the academics differ.
There are definitely a lot of different approaches that homeschoolers take academically. And I was just thinking about my own youngest son. For the past few days, we live on a canyon, and he's been going outside and taking his shears and his shovel, and he's been chopping down trees and clearing brush and making paths down to the little river that's flowing behind us. And I look at that as learning, and I think that's fantastic. And a lot of homeschoolers take that viewpoint that everything that we do is learning. So learning happens all the time. So that's, one viewpoint. So I can appreciate what he's doing. And other homeschoolers feel it's important to have sort of a verification of learning. So they might, say that you need to do worksheets, you need to test, you need to use textbooks, we need validation, as it were, that you're actually learning something. Neither approach is right or wrong. It's just different philosophies. Definitely parents create their own curriculum. Again, I'll use me as an example. When I was a special ed teacher, we didn't have a lot of curriculum for the students that I worked with. So I designed a lot of my own curriculum. So I learned to be really flexible, and a lot of parents do that as well. But we talked earlier about working parents. Some parents don't have the time to do that or the inclination. So it's much easier to just go and purchase an all-in-one, box curriculum. And some curriculum can, cover all subjects. They might just cover, like math curriculum, but some curriculum covers language arts and math and science. And for some families, that's really important that they have something easy. Families can even use AP courses. There are some that are online. There's a provider called Pennsylvania Homeschoolers, and they offer really rigorous AP courses. And some parents are really creative, and they put together their own materials, and they submit it to the College Board, and they get AP approved. I do tend to work sometimes with some very educated parents and who have the skills and knowledge to do that. I don't do that. I send my kids to community college when they get to a certain age. So a lot of homeschoolers do dual enrollment through community college or even four-year colleges, depending on where they live, their income, their opportunities. But that's very, very popular here in California in particular. But with my students all over the country, a lot of kids take college classes. Definitely, I mentioned before, online options. I'm just going to throw out some names that people can research if they want later on. Brave Writer is obviously for writing. OutSchool, that's got a lot of different subjects covered. I mentioned Pennsylvania Homeschoolers. They don't just do AP, courses, but most of their coursework are all the APs. There's Blue Tent, which offers some really rigorous honors courses. ThinkWell is a kind of a self-studied, self-paced provider. There's CTY, Online G3, Michael Clay Thompson. Those are all providers that cater to gifted children. And there are a lot more. A lot of people also use like OpenCourseWare. They're sort of self-paced courses that are provided by colleges like MIT, University of Pennsylvania. My own son took it was a really cool class. It was based on the video game Lord of the Rings Online. It was through Vanderbilt University, through Coursera, which is also like MIT OpenCourseWare. And he studied, Lord of the Rings literature, lore, and the video game. So, just great options for people who like to do online learning. And, co-op is fantastic. Co-ops are great. We have a number of co-ops, around my area. Parents can form their own co-ops. If there's nothing happening, parents can group together. I can teach ASL and dance. I can't teach these other, but at my co-op, I've taught both of them. And then my kids will take, the science labs because there are, parents who have those skills. And then there are just homeschool classes outside of any co-op, which, we've made use of as well. So really there are so many resources, and parents are the best resources. And oftentimes, actually, I'll say parents are the best resources, but also, these days, with all the entrepreneurs out there, a lot of us will hire outside teachers and tutors and professionals to come in and teach groups of homeschooling. So it's just, it's a really expanding opportunity for anyone who loves to work with kids.
Two things. One, you mentioned dual enrollment, and you said, at a certain age, students can go to community college, like when the age is right. What is the range of ages that you've seen? Like, what is I know that the right, quote unquote, right ages for each student, but what is the range of ages that you've seen for students enrolling at these community colleges?
Right. I've seen them really young, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then more typically kids are coming in at like 16, maybe, for junior and senior year. That's more typical. And again, it'll depend on the laws in each state, and actually the laws even at each particular college. So like for my eldest son, we had a little bit of fun when I was ready to outsource him at age 12 because he had started learning calculus. So he took a particular test that you need to take here in California. We went and tried to sign him up, and they objected, saying 12-year-olds don't go to college. But we persevered, and he registered, and he began to take online classes. And then, in a year or two, he went to the campus. But then he ran out of classes to take in his areas. And we had to get real creative because, we didn't have the money to go pay for a UCSD class. So we approached a professor at San Diego State. I emailed him, told him about my son. He agreed to meet my son, and he let my son come in and audit classes. It was upper division physics classes, and he did all the work. He said, he told my son do all the work, and my son, did really well. And the guy invited him to do physics research, after junior year. And the irony of it was he actually got my son hired at San Diego State to tutor this upper division physics course, but they didn't even really know he was on the campus. So hopefully they're not listening. I jest.
I love that. And that was the second thing. I said two things. The second thing was like, didn't you have a cool story about your son going to San Diego State? So,
yeah.
So
yep,
speaking of college, talk to us about what are some of the practical differences for homeschoolers when it comes to like actually applying to college?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And so probably the first thing that I tell students that I'm working with who are homeschooling is to tell your story through essays. So this kind of segues into what you do. It's not that there are ever essays that say, okay, you're a homeschooler, tell us about yourself. But, as you know, there's additional information through the Common Application and on the UC application. And this is a perfect place for homeschoolers to kind of let colleges in on their, on what it was like as a homeschooler. What opportunities did they have that they otherwise would not have had? Or even what, the reasons that homeschooling was beneficial, like in the case of my middle son. He was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at age 10. And so it turned out to be a really good thing that he was already homeschooling along with my older son. And I remember his doctor saying, I'm so glad that you homeschool because we were able to manage his blood sugar so much better than kids who were at school. So, so I think, and he wrote about that, he wrote about just all the things, that made life easier by homeschooling. Also in the Common Application and the UC application, there are some specific sections that ask about your education. Obviously, you're going to list homeschooling. And again, this is going to really depend on what type of homeschooling. And I won't get into all the details, but like here in California, we have independent homeschoolers, which is what I do. So I file what's called an affidavit, which makes me a private school. But for the UCs and for colleges, for all intents and purposes, I'm I'm a homeschooler. Then there's something called a private satellite program. Again, this is California specific, which is like an overhead organization that does record keeping and transcripts, but the parents and the children, they do the homeschooling. And again, they are considered homeschoolers. And then there's charter homeschooling, which here in California, they're considered public schools. So it's important to know what type of homeschooler you are, what the laws are for your state. So when you're filling out the application, you will know, what it is, what boxes that you need to check. And I always encourage students, if there are any questions, obviously reach out to colleges. That's what they're there for. That's what admissions officers are there for. Ask those questions. As a homeschooler, it's actually beneficial, because you have a legitimate reason to be reaching out, asking questions, both students and parents. There are definitely going to be some specific areas on the applications. And as far as, general recommendations for homeschoolers, again, if we're talking about, selective or highly selective, colleges, then it is going to be important for you to have objective data that colleges can look at. So, tests, the SAT or the ACT. Most of the time, I recommend my homeschoolers take 2 to 3 subject tests. In fact, I was just at a counselor breakfast yesterday and with 5 liberal arts colleges, and I asked questions on behalf of homeschoolers, and I laid out everything for them, and they said, yep, this is what we do. So basically what I laid out was, transcripts with course descriptions. They said, yep, that sounds good. I said SAT or ACT and 2 or 3 subject tests. They said yes. I said community college classes or AP exams. They said yes. I said letters of recommendation from people, who know them. They said yes. And normally I recommend 2 to 3 teacher recommendations and 1 or 2 non-academic recommendations, maybe a Scouts leader or a music teacher or somebody like that. So they said yes. So, it was good to know that I'm on the right track. And then as far as for parents, if you're a parent who's the independent homeschooler who's doing the actual, college counseling, as it were, that you're functioning as the college counselor, you will be asked to write your kids' counselor letter. Basically it's a letter of recommendation. It's your time to talk about your students' qualities, both academic and personal, that make them, commendable for any college. Like I mentioned before, you're going to make transcripts with course descriptions. And then you're also going to write a school profile, which, all schools, public, private, they have a profile. And for homeschool profiles, I typically say you're going to write about, the reason that you chose to homeschool and your homeschool philosophy. You're going to actually do a school profile. So what I do in my school profile is I kind of profile my neighborhood and my local public school. Obviously I can't really profile my school because I'm homeschooling 1 or 2 kids. But, I might compare the neighborhood, SAT scores. I'm going to give the demographics of where we live just to give admissions officers, a bird's eye view of what our world is like. In the school profile, you're going to talk about the curriculum that you use, whatever it is. You'll want to describe it a little bit. And then I also do kind of how I use my grading system, how I give grades. And then I also include test scores as well. So a school profile is usually 2 pages long. Counselor letter can be 1 to 3 pages. Course descriptions, really, they can be anywhere from, a few pages up to, 15 pages. Gets a little long, but my philosophy is give colleges more, not less. Put the onus on them to ignore anything because I would rather give them too much than too little. And I'm just going to give a real quick example, if you don't mind, Ethan. My eldest son was vying for a full tuition scholarship at Harvey Mudd, and we went up to the program, and I got a chance to meet the admissions director at the time, and he just came over and thanked me. And he said, "Thank you so much for making it so easy for us to figure out what exactly you guys do as homeschoolers." So, at that point, from then on, that's the model that I've used with families that I work with. And if you want to find examples of the documents that I'm talking about, there are a number of locations online. You can do that. HSLDA has samples of all the documents I've talked about. There's a great Yahoo group called HS, the number 2, COLL. Homeschool to College is what it's about. And they have a files section, and you can find examples of transcript, school profile, counselor letter. So those are 2 good resources, I think, to start off with. And then as far as other areas that homeschoolers can be on the lookout for when applying to college, what's really cool is a lot of colleges actually have designated homeschool readers. Because we've all heard the kind of the horror stories, as it were, of, okay, colleges give, every application 7 to 8 minutes, but as a homeschooler, your application is actually put in a different pile. They do take a little bit more time because they really need to understand your background. So I think in some ways, homeschooling is advantageous just because you do get a longer read. One thing to be also aware of is, even though a lot of colleges have gone test optional, I think I may have mentioned before, for homeschoolers, they are not necessarily going to be test optional, and you would definitely want to contact the colleges. So if, say, you've got a homeschool junior and you're looking at a particular test optional college, go ahead and contact them. It's likely that a homeschooler still might have to submit an SAT or ACT score. It's also possible that community college transcripts might, suffice, but it's really good to ask directly at the source. And yes, homeschoolers sometimes have to do extra testing. There are schools like Georgetown, USC. Those are 2 schools that come to mind. Georgetown has changed their policy a little bit, but I would never say not to do it. But they've always required 3 subject tests from homeschoolers. And even though last year I talked to a rep who said, no, we strongly recommend it. Well, in my mind, I require it. And USC still does require 3 subject tests of homeschoolers. So definitely when you're building a college list as a homeschooler, you definitely want to look at their test policy. And if in doubt, contact them. Contact the colleges. That's really, I can't emphasize that strongly enough.
Becca, how much detail do folks need to have in their transcripts?
Yeah, I like, as I said before, I like more rather than less. I think you look at, regular schools, public, private, and they're pretty straightforward. I do like to add a little bit more detail to transcripts. So, for instance, I like to have test scores on transcripts so that, particularly again, if a student is not a strong tester, you don't need to include it. But for students who are going for selective or highly selective colleges, I think having those right there on that 1-page transcript, is easy. They can see it. The other thing that a homeschooler should have is listing on the 1-page transcript. So a transcript is going to look, basically, you're going to have the 1-page transcript like most transcripts, but then you're going to be attaching the course descriptions below that transcript, and you will have a table of contents to, help admissions officers easily identify the courses. And on the 1-page transcript, it's really good to have just a quick snapshot of the provider. So you might list, so on a transcript, you might list, say, the course. You're going to list the year that it was taken. You're going to list the grade. You're also going to list the provider. So it might be, community college class. It might be co-op. It might be tutor. It might be self-study. You want to indicate that on the transcript, and you're going to, lists the credits for that course. So it's a little bit more detailed because you really want to give them a feel for where this student has, studied these courses. And then, on the bottom of the transcript, the one-page transcript, is a key. So, you have to obviously use abbreviations. But, say you did, DE, and down below is the key. You might say DE is going to be, Dianza Exeter School or something like that. Or above you might see Poway CFS. Below you might give the explanation for what that means. So that way there's no questions asked. They can look at that transcript and they can really get a good feel for the student. And I like to arrange my transcripts by year, by subject, rather than by grade level. This works really well for students who are academically more advanced, but it also can work for, students who are just right at grade level. But like in the case of my eldest son, he was taking, college classes by middle school, and so it kind of would look silly to, say, okay, in fourth grade, he took geometry, et cetera. So it was much easier to just say 2004, geometry, 2005, whatever. So my transcripts that I use, and I've seen other people use as well, just do by the year, by the subject. So, you'll have math up here, you'll have science and technology, second area down, you'll have language arts, you'll have foreign language, history and social sciences, and fine arts and electives. So they do look a little bit different than traditional transcripts, but I always let people know, really, when you make transcripts, just make it understandable and make transcripts however works for you. Some parents are great, at designing transcripts, and other parents, they hire somebody to make them for them, or they pull down transcript samples off the web. So, I love design. I could talk about transcripts forever, but anyhow, we don't have time.
I love it. So, Becca, what are some of your favorite resources that you'd like to point folks to? You've already mentioned a few that are going to be in the show notes, just so everybody knows, but what are some other great ones that you love?
Yeah, I think I mentioned classical homeschooling. It's really growing in popularity, and it's a type of homeschooling that both secular and faith-based homeschoolers use. So I would definitely look into the Well-Trained Mind. There are websites that include email support lists. There's books that talk about classical education, so Well-Trained Mind is a great resource. SEA, secular, eclectic, academic, that's another resource for students who aren't faith-based. That's S.E.A. I mentioned the Homeschool to College Yahoo group. There's a Facebook group called CA College Homeschool Seekers, and that is for people in California. So if your listeners in California, they can check that out. For kids who are profoundly gifted, which I find a lot of homeschoolers are gifted because a lot of times schools can't meet their needs. They should definitely check out the Davidson Young Scholars. They are a good support group. There's an application a process that they go through, but they're a really strong support for highly gifted students. As far as resources, books, there's an old classic called Teach Your Own by John Holt. It's sort of the standard classic, and it was written, I think, back in the 1970s, but, well worth a read just to understand, how the modern homeschooling movement got started. One of my favorite resources, this, I think I mentioned before about self-directed learning. Lisa Rivero wrote a book called Creative Homeschooling, a resource guide for smart families. And she really nailed it. It's very kind of a self-directed, eclectic type of homeschooling written about in the book, and it's a classic. I think it was written in the mid 2000s. It's very good. a book that's not really about homeschooling per se, but it really gives you an insight into why homeschoolers do what they do, is by a guy named John Taylor Gatto, who used to be the superintendent of New York City public schools. But he was so disillusioned by what he saw there. He wrote a book called Dumbing Us Down, and it really talks about the history of public education and how it really, it really was designed to just educate the masses and not the individuals. And so it's definitely sort of a must read for anyone exploring homeschooling. And then there's a more recent book published that is getting rave reviews. It's called The Brave Learner: Finding Everyday Magic in Homeschooling, Learning, and Life by Julie Bogart. And I think the title really aptly, expresses it. Really, it is a magical thing to homeschool. It's not a perfect thing. There are ups and downs. There are plenty of homeschoolers and plenty of days where, you wish you weren't. That is life. And I think she captures it well. And I would encourage anybody who's listening out there to look for your statewide local. You can Google your state and Google, homeschool support. And, here in California, we have a number of homeschool support from California Homeschool Network. We've got Homeschool Association of California. We have a couple of statewide Christian support groups as well. And those are just really great resources to really learn any particular homeschool laws that you would need to know about before you embark on your journey.
Becca, thank you. This has been so helpful. I'm like taking notes and going, okay, I'm buying that when I get home. What would you like to leave folks with?
Boy, that's a great question. I would say that what I would love for people to just realize is that homeschooling is just yet another educational choice. Like public or private or charter. It's just one more choice in the arsenal of education. I've worked with people who have moved in and out of multiple systems. They've gone from a public to homeschool, back to a private to online. And I think that's the lovely thing about it. It really is empowering. It just helps us realize that we can be in control, in charge of our kids' education. It's not that we are the ones doing all the teaching. It's just that we should feel confident and that we are able to organize our kids' education in such a way that it's going to meet their needs best. And I think that homeschooling really, is a great option for parents who, really want to try something different, really realize that, what they see out there is not going to work for their kids.
Becca, thank you so much for your time.
You are welcome. Thank you, Ethan.
That was fun. You can find all the rad resources that Becca mentioned linked on the show notes page, collegeessayguy.com/podcast. And don't go away, because in part 2 of this 2-part series, I sit down with self-directed learning expert Blake Bowles, an advocate for what he calls off-trail learning. In fact, that's the name of his podcast. You can check it out. I love Blake's resources. One of my favorite YouTube videos of his is called Stop Wasting Your Time in High School. And his book is called Better Than College: How to Build a Successful Life Without a 4-Year Degree. Heads up, listening to Blake for too long might lead to deep thinking and a total reconsideration of this whole college thing. Whoops. Stay tuned.